Developer From Software has become something of a household name in the past couple of years. That's, of course, thanks to games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne that have established it as one of the best video game creators working today. And with the enormous success of a game like last year's Elden Ring, it's only natural that the company would have some newly devoted fans willing to charge into whatever battle it's going into next. And because of that, there are a lot of people who are excited about Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon who maybe have never played an Armored Core game before. And while I don't think those people will be necessarily disappointed about what this game has in store for them, I think it's really important to set some expectations off the bat. This is not Robot Dark Souls. The series has never been that, and it certainly still isn't in this new installment. Hi, I'm Giovanni Colantonio. I'm the gaming section lead here at digitaltrends.com, and I'm here with my review of Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon. Now, if you had never really heard of the Armored Core series before last year's Game Awards when Armored Core 6 was revealed, don't feel too bad. Hardcore Armored Core fans would have you thinking that this has always been a really critically acclaimed series that just never had its breakout moment, but that's a little bit of revisionist history. And you don't have to take that from me. Go back and look at reviews of the past couple of Armored Core games, and it's probably pretty clear why From Software moved away from these games to start working on its Dark Souls-type games. This series has always appealed to hardcore enthusiasts who love the mech genre, but it's gotten mixed reviews outside of that, and for good reason. Now, with Armored Core 6, it looks like From Software is looking to give the series some modern appeal, and in a lot of ways, I do think it accomplishes that. However, having played it, you can still see why this series has had trouble breaking into the mainstream. It's undeniably a strong action game, but it's also an acquired taste that I think won't necessarily be for everybody. Okay, that's a silly thing to say. Obviously, no game is for everybody, and especially From Software games certainly aren't for everybody, but let's talk about the basics of what Armored Core 6 is to see if it's a game for you. In Armored Core 6, you control a mech pilot who finds themselves in the middle of an interstellar conflict. There's this mysterious substance called coral, which is capable of fueling a super weapon. And of course, that needs to be stopped, so it's up to you to get in a mech and blow up a whole bunch of robots. Now, obviously, the story is a little more complex than that. It's a pretty lore-heavy, dry sci-fi story that didn't necessarily click for me, but it does get into some interesting territory in its fifth act. It's almost a little old school in its storytelling, and honestly, the game itself is a little old school, and that's something that you really need to know before going into this. You can tell that this game is a continuation of a series that left off 10 years ago on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It's not an enormous open world game or anything like that. The idea is that you're jumping into bite-sized missions on somewhat small maps where you have to blow up a bunch of robots, collect some data, or fight a boss. Honestly, it's a little bit repetitive at times. And on top of that, it's not necessarily the most modern or best looking game. A lot of the levels feel a little bit flat with not too much detail to them. So if you're coming into this expecting something as grand as Elden Ring or honestly even Bloodborne, that's a place where you should take a step back and know what you're getting into. Now, the good news is that the game itself actually plays really, really well. The first couple of minutes that you're going to spend with this are going to feel kind of like a revelation right out the gate. The act of controlling a mech is kind of incredible. Despite the fact that they look really huge and clunky, your mech actually moves at an incredibly fast pace. You can boost around at high speeds like you're in F-Zero, and you can fly in any direction, giving the game a lot of verticality both in exploration and combat. That aspect of the game is pretty fantastic, as From Software has worked pretty hard to make a mech game that feels pretty fluid. And that's also in the basics of how combat works. Rather than having to stop and aim at a bunch of small enemies, this game uses a pretty interesting lock-on system. All you have to do is sort of get enemies close to a reticle in the middle of the screen, and when you fire weapons, they'll sort of track them. Now, that system can feel a little bit loose at times. There were definitely some boss fights where I felt like my shots just weren't hitting enemies, but for the most part, it's a pretty cool system. It allows you to run and gun a little bit more, blowing up a lot of small enemies as you shoot forward. You never really have to take your foot off the gas pedal, and honestly, you shouldn't, because this is an incredibly fast-paced game, and a really demanding one at that. And that's something that I think is going to be a little bit tough for people to handle if they haven't played an Armored Core game before. The controls of this game are, frankly, physically painful. If you're using a controller, there is a lot that you have to manage at once. To fly the robot, you need to hit A to hover in the air, and then move around with the left joystick. Then you have 4 weapons, which are controlled with your triggers and bumpers at the top of the controller, and on top of that, you need to control your camera because the lock-on mechanism for this game is kind of flimsy and doesn't really work all too well, and we'll Talk about that a little bit later. It can feel really awkward to hold the controller, and I would be lying if I said there weren't parts where my hands felt like they were cramping up. And since From Software, of course, doesn't like to give you a lot of accessibility options or difficulty options, that means that there's going to be something of a barrier of entry. It can be really hard to actually play this game, so just be warned of that going into it, especially if you're someone whose hands just hurt really easy. Now, the actual combat system is pretty exciting too. The idea is that you can hold up to 4 weapons at a time. That includes a weapon in each hand and rocket launchers on each shoulder. The battles in this game kind of feel like a mech ballet of sorts. As you're dodging enemy attacks, you're also firing off your 4 different weapons, managing your cooldowns, and making sure you can always get a shot in. The idea of it is actually really different from Dark Souls. In Dark Souls, it's more about standing your ground and looking for an opportunity to attack, but that's not exactly the case here. It's all about pushing the advantage. You want to burn down enemy stagger bars as fast as you can so you can burn down their health quickly. And frankly, I like that system a lot. It makes for a really thrilling action game that's not about sitting and waiting around, but rather going all in on your opponents. And it's not necessarily about dodging damage either, so much as it is mitigating as much of it as possible. You're gonna get hit a lot in this game, and that's okay. But what makes this system really work is the heart and soul of this game, which is the mech customization system. At any point, you can hop into your main menu and throw different parts on your mech that you can buy in a shop and unlock throughout the game. These include different weapons, but it also includes parts like legs and arms, which change the stats of the robot. Some parts might give you a lot more health, but also make your mech way heavier. The idea is that you always need to be tinkering to create the best robot for any mission. And when you die in a mission, failure isn't necessarily failure. Instead, it's an opportunity to go back to the drawing board, find a part that maybe isn't working quite right, and swap it out with something else. In the first major boss in this game, I was banging my head against the wall for hours. My toolset just wasn't really working, and I could only get about a third of its health down at best. At some point, I had to swallow my pride, go into the main menu, and start experimenting around with new weapons and armor types. As soon as I did that, I started stumbling into a build that felt a lot more viable until I was able to take down that boss with ease. This game isn't about getting good. It's about engineering a victory, and I think that makes it kind of special. But of course, I can't pass up a good metaphor, and that's where some of my criticism of Armored Core 6 starts to come into play. I think this game is kind of a perfect metaphor for From Software in both good and bad ways. If you've seen my Elden Ring review on this channel, you know that there are things about the company that I find a little bit frustrating. While I love Elden Ring as much as anybody else, there are some dated elements to that game, like its poor camera, that I just wish From Software would fix. And unfortunately, all of those complaints carry over into this game and are a little more complicated here. So for instance, yes, the third-person camera in this game is not very good, and that is an understatement. Now, in a game like Dark Souls, that's kind of okay. Yeah, it's annoying when a camera gets stuck in a giant enemy, but these enemies tend to be pretty slow, and you can keep them centered in frame for the most part. That's not the case here because the battles are way more hectic and fast-paced. You're dealing with enemies that can move in any direction and zip by you at super speeds. And not only that, the lock-on system, which I mentioned earlier, doesn't work super well, so you can't necessarily track them very easily. So because of that, you're at the mercy of a camera that, frankly, has a mind of its own. It's incredibly hard to keep track of targets, especially smaller ones that fly around arenas at high speeds. There is a boss pretty late in the game that frankly made me want to quit the entire thing. I just couldn't keep track of it as it flew around. I physically could not move the camera fast enough to keep up with it. Now, that's bad enough, and it makes some of the already really hard boss fights really challenging in this, but it's not the only thing that drives me nuts. I personally think that From Software has, shall we say, not the most legible UI in its games, and Armored Core 6 might be its worst yet. And here's an example of that. Your weapons are represented by some really small text in the bottom right corner of the screen. Whenever they run out of ammo, a little bit of red text comes up that lets you know that they're recharging. Now, it's really hard to see that, and it's especially hard during extremely heated battles where you cannot take your eyes off the action for even a second. You always need to be dodging attacks constantly, which makes it very difficult to know when your attacks are actually done with their cooldowns or not. There were some late game boss fights where I frankly just gave up on trying to look in the corner and just was hammering buttons as fast as I could in hopes that they would recharge eventually and fire off a shot. On top of that, there are systems in the game that really aren't explained well at all. There was this early boss fight I had, which was against this giant helicopter type thing, and I was really struggling to make a dent in it. I would only really understand anything about the fight thanks to a reviewer's guide that got sent out with the game, which explained damage types. Now, that guide went into great detail about all the different damage types in the game, and the armor that resists it, and that really helped me make a viable build. But none of that is actually in the game, and that makes it really difficult to know what you're really doing when you're tinkering around with parts. I imagine that a lot of people are going to get help from YouTube videos and guides, and that's fine, but the joy of this game comes from experimenting and tinkering around. It just feels like you're not given all the tools that you need to do that successfully, and that makes parts of the game feel obtuse that I don't think really suits its strong points. So here comes my metaphor. Armored Core 6's loop is all about building the best robot that you can. You're constantly taking out parts that don't necessarily work and putting in better ones. Each change that you make makes a stronger, more viable robot that can get you through really tough battles. And in some ways, you could say that that's sort of a metaphor for iterating on a long-running series like Armored Core. You always want to make the next game better than the last, and to do that, you need to take out the things that don't work and put in new things that work a little bit better. And FromSoftware does do that in a lot of ways that I think make for a really exciting action game. However, there are still a few parts in this that feel rusted. I think things like a poor camera or illegible UI or really demanding controls are going to make it really hard for this game to find mainstream success in the same way that Dark Souls has. It still very much feels like a game that's built for those mecha enthusiasts who have always loved the series. And I do think it's going to bring in some new fans too. It's a really exciting action game, and the act of moving around and shooting just feels really phenomenal at times. However, it also still feels like there's some work to be done to get the series really tuned up. I mean, we haven't had an Armored Core game in 10 years, so I guess it only makes sense that there would be a little bit more work to do. And here's my hope. If this game is successful, I imagine it'll give FromSoftware more room to tinker around, find what works, and find what doesn't work. But to do that, I do think it's going to need to shed a little bit of its stubbornness too. It feels like FromSoftware still has a couple of dated parts in all of its games that really could and maybe should be swapped out. Armored Core 6 almost feels a bit like flying an incredibly powerful, strong mech, but with faulty thrusters on its back. It's certainly not enough to take away from some of the spectacular thrills in this game, but I do hope that it can spend a little bit more time in the garage so that we can see the best possible version of it on its next outing.